Hi guys, I'm Heidi Priebe. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if this is your first time here. On this channel, a lot of what we talk about is how to get inside our own minds, our own thought patterns, our own bodies, our own emotions, in order to get more of what we want out of our lives and less of what we don't want. And today, I want to talk about a particular phenomenon. So the phenomenon of feeling like you lack follow-through. Maybe you identify as the kind of person who has a lot of dreams and goals and visions, and who maybe feels like they have a lot of unexpressed potential inside of them, but for whatever reason, you keep finding yourself not actualizing on that potential. Now, there are, of course, myriad different reasons why this might happen. It could be that you're under-resourced. It could be that you struggle with planning. It could be that you get emotionally dysregulated in the process of working towards your goals, and so you struggle to stay on track. But there's also this one kind of foundational problem that I've seen people run into multiple times without seeming to have an awareness of what it is. And what that is the failure to distinguish what I would call a real, concrete, actionable plan that is likely to play out in reality from a fantasy about the future that we're using to self-regulate through a difficult present moment. Now, here's where it gets sticky. When we know that a fantasy is a fantasy, we are in reality. It's kind of like watching a movie. When I was a kid, I loved Pirates of the Caribbean, but I was never disappointed to wake up one morning and find that I was not a pirate on a ship in the middle of the Caribbean Ocean, because I knew that that was a fantasy, not reality. But when we confuse fantasy and reality, things can get really sticky really fast, because we can start expecting things to happen in reality that we are not taking the proper concrete steps towards in order to make those things happen. And so that's the goal of what we're doing here too, distinguishing between fantasy and reality and figuring out if we have something in the fantasy category that we want to be in the reality category, what would we have to do in order to move that into the proper place? So I remember years ago, there was this coaching program that I was taking, where the people leading the program encouraged us to use this assessment at the beginning that would test the client on a variety of different measures, just so we could kind of get an idea of where they were starting from. And one of the measures was how future-oriented that person was. So how much optimism and hope did they hold for their future? And I remember looking at the assessment and figuring, well, optimism about the future would always be a good thing, of course, right? We need hope and inspiration and motivation to get through our lives. However, the instructors kind of stopped us at one point and pointed out that if we have a client who comes in and they have a very, very high level of optimism about the future, they are highly future oriented, however, they score very low on hedonism and present moment enjoyment, it's possible that what you have is a person who is not truly engaged with and excited about their future, but a person who is really unhappy in the present and who is using fantasies about the future to escape from the present moment. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought about how that's the type of person who is probably most likely to struggle with follow-through. Because if you are so unhappy in the present that you can't even stay associated to it for long enough to figure out what steps you need to take towards those goals, you're going to have a really hard time reaching them. Now, of course, we all need to plan and get excited about and feel motivated to work towards our dreams and visions of the future. So in this video, what we're going to go over is how to differentiate between a plan for the future that is concrete, actionable, and likely to actually play out versus a plan for the future that is actually more of a fantasy. So, without further ado, we're going to go over 5 signs that some of what you are considering to be a goal or a plan might actually belong more in the fantasy category, as well as what you can do to change that if you decide that you would like to. So, sign number 1 that your goal might actually be a fantasy you are using for self-regulation is that you are constantly in the ideation phase when it comes to new ideas, but you rarely, if ever, find yourself executing on your ideas. Now, what might happen here is you might go, I just don't execute because I'm lazy, especially if you're someone who has toxic shame or who has a very negative self-image. You can spend your entire life in this stage beating yourself up for never executing on your ideas. When in reality, the reason you're never executing on your ideas might be because you are never present enough to actually take the first steps. In order to work concretely towards our goals, we have to be in the present moment. We have to be aware of and noticing what's in between us and our goals. What about our lives exactly as they are today is incompatible with the goal that we have for the future. That's an incredibly important thing to be present with because it shows us the roadmap for getting there. But if we are constantly dissociated into the future because we find the present really painful and we don't actually like taking a look at our lives as it is today right now, it's going to be really easy to just chronically dissociate into that fantasy about the future where you see maybe the last 5 steps that you would need to take to get there, but not the first 5. Because the first 5 would require you to look at your life exactly as it is today and acknowledge the full spectrum of where you are at. If you have this dream where you're super wealthy, but today, right now, you are in a ton of debt and you have no idea how to get yourself out of that debt, what might happen when you think about your current financial situation is you might get extremely overwhelmed. And that sense of overwhelm, particularly if you're someone who struggles with toxic shame, might lead your emotional system to desperately grasp onto anything it can to make itself feel better. And in this case, what it grasps onto might be a fantasy about the future where the problem is solved. But we cannot solve problems until we start from the ground that we are actually starting from. So we have to be willing to land inside of the problem, to orient ourselves to where we are today in relation to where we would like to get to, and spend a lot more time looking at that than we do thinking about the future fantasy. It's kind of like looking at a map and going, here's this phenomenal mountain peak that I want to arrive at, but being completely unwilling to look at the "you are here" mark. The "you are here" mark tells us where we are relative to where we want to get to. And if we are just chronically imagining ourselves on the mountaintop, we're not going to be willing to look at the path through the valley that we have to take to even arrive at the base of the mountain, right? A goal or a plan starts with the present moment, and it gets built continuously out of that. So people who are on their way to success are a lot more focused on what they're doing today and tomorrow and the next day than where they imagine themselves to be in 5 years. That might be a program that runs in the background of their mind that keeps them motivated, but the majority of their thoughts and actions are oriented towards what they are doing in the present. So that's a really big sign that kind of distinguishes a real goal or plan from a future one. Are you thinking a lot about what you're going to be doing in the next 72 hours to work towards your goal? Or when you think about your goal, are you largely thinking way into the future without a lot of awareness of what's going to happen between now and then? Sign number 2, that what you're considering to be a goal might actually be more of a self-regulatory fantasy, is that when you picture the future, you're picturing the highlight reel, but you're not really picturing the reality of what that future would look like on a day-to-day basis. So if you want to be an award-winning actor or an award-winning novelist, or you want to be super rich and powerful, are you only picturing yourself accepting the awards, checking your bank account and seeing how much money is in it, having the perfect, most beautiful wedding imaginable with your soulmate? Or are you also picturing what it would feel like to be that kind of person on a day-to-day basis? So if you wake up and you are someone who is extraordinarily powerful and wealthy, do you think that really your job day to day is going to be to sit around and enjoy your wealth? Or are there going to be a whole slew of new problems that come along with this fantasy life that if you were to have it in reality, you would have to deal with? If you were to achieve all of these things that you seem to want so badly, what would you have to give up about the life that you have right now? Would you have less spare time? Would you have to vet your social circle more carefully? Would you have, let's say, a company to manage full of a lot of moving parts that would add new forms of stress to your day-to-day life? Now, this is not to say that you want to take your fantasy or take your vision of the future and get really negative about it, but what you do want to do, if it's actually a goal or a plan you have, is get really realistic about it. So it's not about throwing your current life in the garbage and trading it in for a life that is perfect and has no problems. What you're looking at when you set a real goal that is not a fantasy is which of my current problems do I want to trade in for different problems that I like better. There is not a path in the world you could possibly go down, and there is no place you could possibly arrive at in life where you do not have any problems, where you are just problem-free forever. But a good life is about having a life full of problems you like. So if I want to be an award-winning novelist, do I actually like sitting down to write? Do I like the problem of writing a chapter, realizing something was kind of off in there? I don't really know what it is, so I'm going to reread it 17 times and try to figure out what I need to change. Is that a fun problem for me to solve? If I want to have a family, do I actually like the problem of figuring out how to raise kids? If I want to have a healthy relationship, do I like the problem of learning to understand a new person, adjusting to the ways in which they're different from me, figuring out conflict resolution skills, and getting to a place where we can relate in a healthy way? And am I willing to accept the limitations of all of those things? Am I willing to accept that a romantic relationship is not going to solve every area of my life? It's not inherently going to make me feel good about myself forever. It's not going to fix issues that I have with my family or with other relationships. It's not going to give me an enduring sense of purpose and direction. And the same goes for any particular fantasy. Are we looking at this fantasy as a one-stop shop for solving all of the problems we currently have? Or if it's a realistic plan or goal, are we looking at the new problems it's going to bring into our life and saying, yes, those are the problems I want. Those are the things I want to struggle with on a daily basis. That's the kind of work, those are the kind of questions that I want to spend my life trying to answer, knowing that I'm going to get frustrated en route, that I'm going to get stuck, that it's going to feel difficult and challenging. Is that the type of challenge and discomfort that I want to have? That's how we know that we are looking at a more realistic plan as opposed to a fantasy one. In a fantasy plan, there are no problems. Our lives are solved forever and we never again feel a negative emotion because we have found the one thing that forever takes away all of our pain. Or we're romanticizing even the problems that it would bring about, right? But in reality, we know that any plan or any goal we take on is going to include challenge, pain, failure, strife, and we still want to say yes to it. We look at the goal and go, that's the kind of problems I want to deal with on a day-to-day basis. If your plan is more of a fantasy, you're going to get discouraged real fast the second you try to move towards it in reality and realize, oh, this isn't a perfect problem-free path. Ergo, I'm going to abandon ship because I didn't want the reality of this thing and the problems that come along with it. I just wanted the fantasy. And if you just want the fantasy, it's a lot easier to stay exactly where you are, dissociate into the fantasy, use it to regulate through a difficult moment, and then go back to whatever life you have built for yourself in the present, which probably includes the problems that you're more comfortable solving. Sign number 3 that you might be self-regulating through plans about the future rather than creating realistic plans about the future is that you feel very defensive talking about your plans for the future because some part of you knows that you don't actually intend to follow through on them. So if you're telling somebody about, let's say, a business idea that you have, and they start asking you questions about the steps you're going to take to get there, you might instantly feel super defensive because they're poking holes in your fantasy. Your fantasy is a world where you don't have to take action to get to those goals, or give anything up, or trade anything in about the life that you currently have in order to get the one that you want. So when we have a real, concrete, actionable plan, and people start giving us feedback on it, especially if we have explained clearly to them where we're at, we usually welcome and feel enthusiastic about good feedback because it helps us get closer to where we want to get to. But if our plan is not a real plan and it's actually just a fantasy that we use to self-regulate, someone pointing out to me that I'm not taking the relevant steps in that direction is going to feel like they're stomping on my daydream. Like, how dare you bring the reality into this? This isn't what that's about. You know, it's kind of like watching Pirates of the Caribbean and someone going, well, you know, this could never have happened because X, Y, and Z. Shut up! I'm watching Pirates of the Caribbean. I don't want to remember that it's a movie, right? I want to immerse myself in this and have fun inside this make-believe world by temporarily suspending reality. And the same is true when we have a fantasy. If it's not something that we're truly trying to work towards in reality, it's going to feel really annoying when people start talking about the reality of it. And we might find ourselves not wanting to share what we think are our dreams or goals with people who we know are going to ask questions about the reality of them, because that's going to force us out of that kind of spell that we're in. Now, this is just something to note, once again, right? It's not to say that you have to take advice from absolutely anybody who wants to chime in on your goals or plans, but it tends to be a pretty red flag alerting you to the fact that a goal or plan that you think you have is actually more of a fantasy if you get really upset anytime someone tries to bring the reality into it. Our fantasies tend to be very private things that we can get real touchy about real quick. But our goals and plans tend to be more realistic things that feedback can be really helpful for. Or even someone just asking a question that you realize you don't have the answer to can be really helpful if you're working towards a concrete goal, right? Because even though it might feel kind of embarrassing for a moment, it alerts you to a blind spot or a gap in your knowledge that might be really important for you to focus on in order to get closer to your goal. So overall, that feedback process is more helpful than it is annoying. But again, if it's a fantasy, feedback is more annoying than it is helpful. So just noting where you fall on that scale might be really useful in pointing you in the direction of figuring out whether what you're working with is a plan or if it's just a fantasy. The next sign that what you think is your plan about the future might actually be more of a fantasy that you're using to self-regulate through difficult moments is that the older you get and the longer your life goes on for, the more regret you experience about the life that you didn't lead. And this is one that can be kind of tender and heavy for a lot of people. Because when the best option we have out of our lives from a young age is to dissociate into a fantasy about a better life, what we tend to develop is a feeling of learned helplessness. This feeling of, I don't actually have the power to make my life better, but there's this small, hopeful part of me that knows that I'm capable of more, right? That knows that there's a me out there who's living more in alignment with the person I actually am and who has relationships and a life that reflects my authentic self. So there might be this awareness throughout a lot of your life that you're not living up to what you know or can conceive of to be your true potential. Probably because you're doing what you learned to do from a young age and dissociate from the present and chronically focus on fantasies about the future. But there's a certain point where this strategy kind of starts to fail, right? When you're in your early 20s and everybody is full of hopes and dreams and plans for the future, it might not be as obvious to you or to other people observing you that you're not actually taking the relevant steps towards your plans. But by the time a few more decades have passed and you're looking back on your life and recognizing a lot of what I wanted to happen, for whatever reason I couldn't find a way to make happen, it starts to become harder to deny that unless you change something, your goals and dreams and plans might never come to fruition. And you might end up with a deep sense of regret because you have memories of all of these plans and ambitions you once had, but when you look back on your life, you notice that those things didn't happen. Now, I want to be clear, it is not ever too late as long as you are alive to turn that train around. Maybe some goals have certain types of expiration dates, however, you are never at a loss of where to take your life next if you can learn the art of presencing yourself and actually starting to build from the ground up. So instead of starting at the end of the process, start now in the next 72 hours, and you will start to actually build a life that you want to have. Nobody just wakes up the next morning and magically has the life that they want, but everybody has the capacity to do something in the next 24 hours of their life that brings them closer to the future they actually want. The only way to guarantee that you are never going to get there is to spend every 24-hour period of your life thinking and fantasizing about the future without taking any steps towards it. So if this is a place that you have arrived at, this place of recognizing that you are a person with so much potential, so many hopes, so many dreams about the future, and that you have always been that way, but very few of those plans have come through, and you're experiencing a sense of regret about that, ask yourself the question, what could I do in the next 24 hours? Because I can guarantee you that the people out there who are currently working towards their goals and dreams and plans and are actually going to get to where they want to get to, they have a plan for what they are going to be doing within the next 24 to 72 hours to get there. And that is what separates you, if you are not doing that, from the type of people who are. And there's this other kind of tender edge here that I want to bring up, which is that the more we live our life in the present moment, the more wonderful memories we end up with. Because we're actually paying attention to our lives as they're happening. And we're actually noticing the really beautiful moments when they arrive to us, often completely unexpectedly. If we are always zoned out and dreaming about a different life, it's really hard to make meaningful memories inside of the present moment. And so it's much more likely that we'll be left with a sense of emptiness and regret when we look back on our lives if we spent the whole time dissociated into some fantasy about things being different in the future. In order to feel thankful and grateful and happy and satiated looking back on our lives, we have to be willing to show up to the present moment and actually notice what's happening inside of that moment and learn to love and appreciate what's happening. So this idea of focusing on the next 24 hours is really in large part about bringing our attention back to the only thing that's ever real, which is the present moment. And if we are living inside of the part of our lives that is real, we're going to naturally, at the end of our lives, end up with a plethora of experiences and memories that we feel really grateful to have had. That sense of emptiness looking back on our lives won't even be a possibility, because we won't have spent our lives sleepwalking, we'll have spent them living. And chances are, if you stay really committed to the act of living in the moment, which can very much include taking consistent, concrete action towards your goals, you're gonna find that what happens en route is a lot more meaningful than what happens at the top of the mountain anyways. There's a million cliches about that, so I will spare you them in this video, but there are a million cliches about that for a reason. What happens to us on the way towards our goals is where the story of our life actually unfolds. And we are robbing ourselves of the opportunity to have a life story at all if we are spending our entire lives avoiding the present moment in favor of dreaming about a distant future. And the last sign, and this is a huge one, that your plans or visions of the future are more fantasy than they are reality, is that you see this kind of future version of yourself as the most or the only authentic version of you. So you have this idea that you're gonna build yourself into a different person, and maybe that person is the you that you know is hiding in there, but that you feel like isn't allowed to or won't be able to emerge until you have a completely different life. Again, we build a completely different life from the present moment out. So in the moments when you're feeling overwhelmed and you're noticing yourself go into this magical fantasy about the future, ask yourself, who is present in this moment? If I were to drop the fantasy and actually look around and survey the life that I have at this exact moment in time, including the person that I am in this exact moment in time, what would I see? What would be coming up for me emotionally? In this moment where I'm dissociating into a future where I feel prideful and happy and like I have no problems, is it possible that what's actually going on for me in the present moment is a feeling of shame, inadequacy, pain in some capacity? And how can I stay present with those feelings? How can I accept that all of those things are a part of who I am? And that I am never going to get to a level of success where I don't feel those difficult emotions. I have to take who I am with me on this journey if I ever want to get anywhere. So who I am right now in this moment is not a mistake or an accident that I can correct by dissociating into a fantasy about the future where all the things I don't like about myself are magically absent and only qualities that I do like about myself are present and on display for everyone to see. There is no version of the future that is real, that involves you not having to experience any of the more difficult aspects of the human experience. You can be the richest person in the world, you could have the love of your dream or ideal partner, you could accomplish everything you have ever wanted to accomplish in your life, and none of that, not a single part of it, is going to save you from being human. You will arrive at any of those goals and you will still have shame, pain, regret, insecurity, wounding from childhood. All of those things you cannot personal develop your way out of. You have to learn how to integrate them, be present with them, feel them, accept them as a part of the human experience, and learn to bring them with you on your pathway towards your goals. And you might be wondering at this point, why even work towards goals if I'm still gonna feel all of those things when I get there? And this brings us all the way back to point number one. Realistic plans and goals are about trading in the problems of your current life for problems that you would prefer to have. There is no life where you have no problems, but setting the right types of goals means we're putting ourselves on the track to having problems that we more naturally enjoy having. And usually those problems are problems that are more aligned with our authentic selves. So as the people we actually are, which questions would we like to spend our lives exploring? Which problems would we like to spend our lives chipping away away at? Which types of relationships with which types of people would we like to spend our life figuring out how to navigate? Because in all of these areas, we are never done, ever. We will never have a day in our life where we have finally wiped our hands clean of all problems and there's not a single area left in our lives where there is no tension or nothing to resolve. So our absolute best shot at having a life that we actually want to show up to is picking the right types of problems that are aligned with the people we actually are, the holistic version of ourselves, and spending our lives struggling delightfully with those problems. That's what it means to have a realistic plan or goal. To have an escapist worldview means to hold tight to the belief that something we could do or figure out in the future will absolve us from pain forever. That's not an option for any of us, and it never will be. But if we can kind of mine the gold from those fantasies, so figure out, what about my life in those fantasies, or my relationships, or myself, do I absolutely love, and how can I balance out that fantasy with the realities of what would come along with getting that thing, and find a way to start concretely working towards it. You know that you have found a path that you enjoy being on when you like taking the steps towards it. It's not just about picturing the mountaintop. You're actually enjoying the hike because you have chosen a goal that you feel aligned with. So every step of the way, you are getting closer to the type of person that you actually want to be in the world and the types of problems that you actually enjoy trying to solve. All right, that's all I have to say for today on the topic of whether you are using your goals and plans as self-regulatory fantasies or whether they are more realistic. As always, let me know in the comments what's coming up for you as you're watching this. I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other and your inner children, and I will see you back here again super soon.